law enforcement strategy and ongoing investigations. In coverage of major crime cases, Paul Mauro, a Fox News contributor and retired NYPD inspector, is cited explaining how law enforcement is approaching active manhunts and investigations, including tactical decisions and police responses. Mauro has discussed how police tactics and investigative priorities are evolving as officers work complex cases such as the Brian Koberger student murder case and other violent crimes. He highlights law enforcement's need to interpret evidence and suspect behavior carefully. Broader law enforcement context and crime policy views. Mauro has been outspoken about broader trends in policing and crime, criticizing what he sees as weak crime management in liberal cities and saying those approaches contribute to challenges for law enforcement across the country. He also appears in legal analysis segments, e.g., discussing criminal trials, where he breaks down courtroom strategy and reasonable doubt standards from a law enforcement perspective. What if the biggest mistake in a crime investigation isn't what police do, but what they don't do? Former NYPD Inspector Paul Mauro says law enforcement is quietly making calculated moves the public doesn't fully understand, and those decisions could change everything. As America watches high-profile crime cases unfold, questions are growing louder. Why are police taking so long? Why aren't arrests happening sooner? And what's really going on behind the scenes? According to Paul Mauro, law enforcement isn't guessing, they're playing a long, strategic game. In this report, we break down how investigators are thinking, what signals they're watching for, and why patience, not speed, may decide the final outcome. Stay with us, because the logic behind these decisions might surprise you. What if the most important part of a criminal investigation is the part the public never sees? According to Paul Mauro, law enforcement thinking is far more disciplined, patient, and calculated than most people realize, especially in high-profile cases that dominate national headlines. When a major crime occurs, public pressure immediately builds. Social media demands instant arrests, television panels speculate non-stop, and every delay is interpreted as incompetence or failure. But from a law enforcement perspective, rushing is often the fastest way to lose a case forever. Mauro explains that investigators are trained to think in terms of outcomes, not optics. The goal is not to make an arrest quickly, but to make an arrest that survives court scrutiny, withstands defense challenges, and leads to a conviction. In modern policing, every move is documented, recorded, and eventually dissected by defense attorneys. Law enforcement officers know that a single procedural mistake can unravel months or even years of work. That is why investigators often appear slow or cautious, when in reality they are building layers of proof. Mauro emphasizes that police rarely act on instinct alone. They gather digital evidence, forensic data, witness statements, surveillance footage, phone records, financial trails, and behavioral patterns. Each piece on its own may seem insignificant, but together they form a narrative that prosecutors can defend in court. This process takes time, especially in complex cases involving multiple locations, digital footprints, or suspects who understand how to avoid detection. Another critical part of law enforcement thinking is understanding suspect behavior. Mauro points out that criminals almost always make mistakes, but those mistakes don't always happen immediately. Investigators often allow suspects to continue living their normal lives under surveillance, waiting for inconsistencies, slips in communication, or actions that contradict earlier statements. From the outside, it may look like police are doing nothing. In reality, they may be watching quietly, mapping routines, analyzing movements, and waiting for the moment when the evidence becomes undeniable. This strategy reduces the risk of premature arrests that could alert suspects and cause them to destroy evidence or flee. Mauro also highlights the importance of evidence hierarchy. Not all evidence is equal, and law enforcement prioritizes evidence that is hardest to challenge in court. Physical and forensic evidence, such as DNA, weapon analysis, or digital metadata, often carries more weight than eyewitness testimony, which can be unreliable under stress. That is why investigators may delay action until laboratory results are confirmed or digital records are fully analyzed. In today's legal environment, where defense teams aggressively attack police credibility, investigators must be meticulous. A rushed arrest without airtight evidence doesn't just risk acquittal, it can also damage public trust in the justice system. Technology has further changed how law enforcement thinks. Mauro explains that modern investigations are no longer limited to street-level work. Digital forensics now play a central role. Phones, cloud storage, GPS data, social media activity, and encrypted messaging apps create vast trails of information. Collecting and analyzing this data requires warrants, legal approvals, and specialized expertise. Investigators must ensure that every digital step complies with constitutional protections, because illegally obtained evidence can be thrown out entirely. This legal complexity slows investigations but strengthens cases in the long run. Another factor Mauro stresses is coordination between agencies. High-profile cases often involve local police, state authorities, and federal agencies working together. Each agency has its own procedures, jurisdictions, and legal boundaries. Coordinating these efforts takes time, but it prevents jurisdictional conflicts and evidence mishandling. Law enforcement thinking prioritizes unity and consistency, knowing that fragmented investigations create openings for defense attorneys to argue confusion, contamination, or misconduct. The public may see multiple agencies involved and assume chaos, but internally, there is often a clear command structure guiding the investigation. Public communication is also a strategic decision. Mauro explains that police deliberately limit what they share with the media, not because they are hiding information, but because revealing too much can compromise the case. Suspects monitor news coverage. Witnesses can be influenced by public narratives. False confessions can emerge when details are widely known. By controlling information flow, law enforcement protects the integrity of the investigation. This silence frustrates the public, but from an investigative standpoint, it is often essential. Mauro also addresses the emotional dimension of policing. Investigators are human, and they feel the weight of victims' families waiting for answers. However, law enforcement training teaches officers to separate emotion from decision-making. Acting out of sympathy or anger can lead to mistakes. The discipline to wait, observe, and verify is central to professional policing. Mauro argues that this emotional control is often misunderstood as indifference, when it is actually a sign of professionalism. In today's polarized climate, law enforcement decisions are also scrutinized politically. Mauro notes that investigators are acutely aware that their actions may be interpreted through ideological lenses. This adds another layer of caution. Officers must ensure their decisions are defensible not just legally, but publicly. This reality has reshaped policing culture, making documentation, transparency, and procedural correctness more important than ever. Every step must be justified, every delay explained internally, and every action aligned with policy. Ultimately, Mauro's insight reveals that law enforcement thinking is rooted in patience, structure, and long-term vision. Investigations are not races, they are methodical processes designed to withstand intense legal and public scrutiny. While the public demands speed, police focus on certainty. While headlines demand answers, investigators focus on evidence. This gap between perception and reality fuels frustration, but it also explains why many successful cases only make sense in hindsight. When an arrest finally happens, it often appears sudden, but in truth, it is the result of months of quiet, deliberate work that most people never see. Paul Mauro's broader perspective on law enforcement goes beyond individual cases and dives into what he sees as a nationwide shift in how crime is handled, punished, and even discussed. From his point of view, policing does not operate in a vacuum. Every decision officers make on the street is influenced by political leadership, prosecutorial policies, public opinion, and media narratives. Mauro argues that over the past several years, this environment has fundamentally changed, and not always in ways that support effective law enforcement. He believes many police departments are being asked to control rising crime while simultaneously operating with reduced authority, limited public backing, and increased fear of professional consequences. One of Mauro's central arguments is that policy decisions made far from the crime scene directly affect what happens on the ground. When cities adopt policies that reduce penalties for repeat offenders, limit pretrial detention, or discourage proactive policing, officers quickly learn that arrests may not lead to meaningful consequences. Mauro explains that when criminals realize they are likely to be released quickly, deterrence weakens. This does not just impact crime rates, it affects police morale. Officers begin to question the value of risking their safety to arrest individuals who may be back on the street within hours. Over time, this creates a form of quiet disengagement, where police still respond to calls but avoid proactive enforcement that could invite scrutiny or disciplinary action. Mauro also emphasizes the role of prosecutors in shaping law enforcement behavior. In many major cities, prosecutors have adopted policies that deprioritize certain crimes or decline to pursue charges unless cases meet extremely high thresholds. While these policies are often framed as criminal justice reform, Mauro argues they can unintentionally embolden offenders. From a law enforcement perspective, if officers believe their work will be dismissed in court, it alters how they approach investigations and arrests. The system becomes fragmented, with police, prosecutors, and political leaders operating with different priorities, leaving public safety as an unintended casualty. Media coverage, according to Mauro, further complicates this landscape. High-profile incidents involving police misconduct receive wall-to-wall coverage, while successful crime prevention efforts often go unnoticed. This imbalance shapes public perception and, in turn, policy. Mauro points out that constant negative portrayals of policing can erode trust and cooperation between communities and law enforcement. When witnesses are reluctant to speak, victims fear retaliation, and communities view police with suspicion, investigations become more difficult. The result is a cycle where reduced cooperation leads to fewer solved cases, which then fuels further criticism of law enforcement effectiveness. Another key element in Mauro's analysis is the psychological impact on officers working under intense scrutiny. Modern policing, he argues, involves a level of second-guessing that previous generations did not experience. Every interaction can be recorded, edited, and shared globally within minutes. While accountability is necessary, Mauro believes the fear of viral condemnation can paralyze decision-making in high-pressure situations. Officers may hesitate in moments that require decisive action, not because they lack training, but because they are calculating legal, administrative, and reputational risks in real time. This hesitation can have serious consequences for both public safety and officer safety. Mauro also discusses the uneven application of law enforcement policies across different jurisdictions. He notes that crime trends often shift from areas with strict enforcement to those with looser policies. Criminals adapt quickly, learning where they are less likely to be stopped, charged, or sentenced. This migration effect places additional strain on certain cities, while others benefit from policies that maintain consistent consequences for criminal behavior. From Mauro's perspective, this inconsistency undermines the idea of equal justice and creates confusion for both law enforcement and the public. Economic factors play a role as well. Mauro highlights how rising living costs, housing instability, and drug addiction intersect with crime. However, he cautions against using these factors as excuses rather than context. Law enforcement, he argues, is often tasked with managing the visible consequences of deeper social problems without being given the tools or authority to address them effectively. When police are expected to serve as social workers, mental health responders, and crime fighters simultaneously, something inevitably suffers. Mauro believes that clear boundaries and realistic expectations are essential for effective policing. Training and recruitment are another concern. Mauro points out that many departments are struggling to recruit experienced, motivated officers. Negative public sentiment, lower pay relative to risk, and uncertain career stability discourage potential candidates. As veteran officers retire early, departments lose institutional knowledge that cannot be replaced quickly. This experience gap affects investigative quality, mentorship, and leadership within departments. From Mauro's standpoint, rebuilding law enforcement capacity requires not just funding, but cultural and political support. Despite his criticism, Mauro does not argue against reform entirely. Instead, he stresses that reforms must be grounded in reality rather than ideology. Effective law enforcement, he says, requires balance, accountability without paralysis, compassion without permissiveness, and reform without abandoning consequences. Policies should be evaluated based on outcomes, not intentions. If a policy leads to increased victimization or reduced public safety, Mauro believes it should be reconsidered regardless of political alignment. Ultimately, Mauro's broader law enforcement perspective paints a picture of a system under strain, caught between competing demands and conflicting messages. Police are expected to reduce crime, respect civil liberties, maintain public trust, and navigate political pressures simultaneously. According to Mauro, the path forward begins with honest conversations about what policing can and cannot do, supported by policies that align enforcement, prosecution, and public expectations. Without that alignment, law enforcement will continue to operate in a reactive mode, struggling to keep pace with evolving crime while facing growing skepticism from the very communities they are meant to protect.